I don't have a cover to show you this time. The magazine's across the continent, basically. This is a Wargamer magazine game, Peter the Great. And I think I played it once, maybe twice, and never really gave it a full chance. As I look over it, I think it may be a little bit more interesting than I've kind of remembered it as. And sometimes games that have kind of these old-time graphics coming from that era, I tended to dismiss a little too easily. This one actually has a few little interesting things about it, but it may not be enough to overcome the blandness. And especially, you know, this is what, 17, let's see if I have the year somewhere. Yeah, 1709. During the Great Northern War. And what do you have? You have what looked like 19th century proto-NATO, at least to me, symbols being used. And that kind of immediately detracts the dull coloring and the simplicity of some of the rules. But there are some little tricks in here. So, first of all, let's take a look at the units. And the first number over here is the combat strength. The second number is going to be a morale rating, and third number is the movement allowance. Sequence of play is simple. I go, you go. First the Swedes go, they move, they fight, and then they rally. And then the Russians go and do the same. Movement is going to be determined largely through the terrain effects chart, which has different movement rates for different types of units. A little bit of added, information than is usually present in these kind of more simple games. Zones of control in this game are completely fluid, but they require an attack, which you'll see in a little bit. Combat is going to be, like I said, mandatory for the most part. Let's see if we've got terrain effects on combat, and I haven't really been paying too much attention to these, but under here you have sort of temporary terrain units. These weren't put on the map for some reason. They don't get destroyed or anything, so it's kind of weird. The main decision was, I guess, the need to indicate these partial readouts. You also have this fortification line here, which is going to be, you have to excuse me, I'm very fatigued from dancing last night. An entrenchment hex side, which gives you a column shift if you attack across it from the wrong direction. These are just setup lines here. There's 4 different scenarios to the game. Two pretty much historical ones. This is the historical setup. Then there's one where you're allowed to set both sides up anywhere within their setup territory. And then there's a couple of alternative history ones. Because this was really a terrible attack by Charles XII. Okay. So where were we? Well, we were going to jump to combat, but let's take a couple of other things in hand pretty quickly. Stacking is generally one unit. You can add an artillery unit, and you can add parenthesized units like this, and then leaders don't count against stacking. Command control units are out of command control. There's a set of markers for that. If they can't be traced within a command radius, and I haven't talked much about leaders. Leaders have a sort of morale and combat effectiveness rating first, a movement rating, and then up here they have their command radius. So for a unit to fully operate correctly, it has to be within command radius, and there aren't a whole lot of commanders, especially the Russians seem to not have a terribly dense command structure there. For the Swedes, we got Charles XII here, who is very good at combat and at inspiring the men, but he'd just taken a wound to his foot and essentially has no command radius. He's handed the command over to his subordinate. Okay, for combat itself, you're going to follow kind of the general rules where there is mandatory combat due to adjacency. All units have to be attacked by all adjacent units. You can only make multiple multi-unit attacks if it's the case that all attacking units are adjacent to all defending units, etc. Artillery is the one little twist in this. The artillery units are allowed to fire at a range, and this is really going to be hard to see, but here, if we zoom way in, that top little 7 up there, that's the range on that artillery number. Now, I can't read those without the camera or a magnifying glass. And I don't think I ever would have been able to tell you the truth. I don't think that's just my eyes. Those are pretty much unreadable. They're able to bombard from that range, and that can be thrown into other attacks, or it can be done alone on a bombardment table. Now, there is a line of sight, though, for firing the artillery. And in particular, there's blocking terrain to the line of sight, which I believe is listed here. But there's also units block sight. And I think it's going to be hard to keep fire lines open in this game. Just from my memory of these kind of games, I'm used to bombarding being allowed over units in the Napoleonic stuff or whatever. Okay. Combat itself is resolved on a fairly complicated looking table. It depends on whether the attacker is demoralized or normal. And we're going to be tracking over here the morale of the different armies. And they get demoralized at these levels, the Russians at the higher level. And you figure out a differential of the combat strengths and roll a die. And you put modifiers based on the competing morale values, basically. So if a 6 morale, and that's going to be a differential again, if a 6 morale attacking unit attacks a 4 morale defending unit, you'll be getting a +2 on the table. So to some extent, morale may be more important than size, and it has other effects as well. If only artillery is fires on this bombardment table. And what you can see is the results are retreats and possible step losses there. Here it gets designated by, and only the defender gets hit there. Here it gets designated by different, the different sides, either the attacker or the defender. You actually have both retreat results, which are kind of weird. Not used to seeing that kind of stuff. You have exchanges. Now there's a special rule on exchanges that I have to get to. Yes. Terrain effect. We'll talk about that in a bit. Artillery, when it fires, may not fire at full strength, depending on how far the range is out. And that's going to be based on the caliber of the artillery. Now there are a lot of different symbols here. Here's light artillery, medium, heavy, mortars, and then some horse artillery that we're using as well. And they all have different ranges required there. Okay. So let's see. Leaders add their rating to the combat strength of the units after all terrain modifications have taken place. And you're basically allowed 1 leader per unit. If a leader's stacked with a single unit, if a leader's stacked with a unit, one of the leaders in that hex can add his combat strength. If you wander into empty leaders, there's a chance they get killed. The backside has a weaker version, a replacement version for the leaders. I forgot to mention. The units have steps on them. They basically take one step, one additional step loss. They're 2-step units. All right. Rallying. If your units are routed, and that'll be indicated by this from combat results, they have to be rallied in order to do anything again. I didn't really explain command control too well. So, command control just prevents you from entering a zone of control, basically. You can't. You can stay in one if you're out of command control. If you take a route result, you get a little route marker, and that's going to mean, I don't know what. That's going to mean if you don't rally, you're removed from the game, but you don't count against army morale. Okay. So rallying, all your routed units have to try to rally. You roll a die. You have to get equal to or less than their morale rating. And in some cases, that's pretty easy to do. Look, these guys have a morale rating of 6. Your leader adds his value to it. If your army's been demoralized, you have to roll less than. Okay, let's talk about army morale. Each time you lose an artillery unit, and each strength point of non-artillery is going to come off your army morale. And eventually it hits down here, and you become demoralized. And being demoralized causes a few effects. The morale check, they have a harder time. On their attacks, they use the demoralized line on the CRT. And if you end up getting down to 0 here, you lose the game. However, there are some special rules for surrendering which allow you to avoid ugly situations once you're demoralized. The victory conditions for the game: the Russian army demoralized and the Swedish army not, or both armies demoralized, gives the Swedes a marginal victory. They get a substantial if they also have unrouted units in at least 2 of, and these are hexes over here, I don't know, there's little crosses, these little crosses, there's got to be more than a couple of these. They're ones in the camp, other ones are back here. So the Russians kind of have to defend more than just the camp. It doesn't matter though if the Swedes don't demoralize the Russians. Okay, the Russian marginal is if the Swedish army is demoralized and the Russian army is not, and their substantial is the same, but they have to have exited 5 unrouted combat units off the south, which I presume is that way. Yep. There's the beautiful compass routes. Okay. The Russian player is going to be under some restrictions where he can't move on the first turn. And then on the second turn, you're allowed to start moving things that start outside the camp and 1 special unit. And then you start trickling units in from the camp that can start moving. If a Swedish unit moves within 5 hexes of the camp, though, the Russians are all alerted and are able to do something. The Swedes were attempting a surprise attack here, and it really didn't succeed. Okay. I haven't talked about fire zones. This is one of the cool little things, and it's got to be in here. See, one of the things is this, I normally like this 3-column type of rules presentation, but I can say there is a problem with this in that they didn't use a dark enough font for separations. There's not enough segmentation within the rule book to really appeal to me. So I'm trying to find fire zones now because I didn't notice them. And frankly, I don't see them. Are they an optional rule? I don't believe so. Oh, geez. It's got to be here. Yeah, I don't know. All right, well, so basically, I don't know if you're allowed to do them from these guys. I can't find the rule, so. And they don't mention anything about them where I know they do work, which is the readouts. But the basic idea of them is you're allowed to pop one of these out into a hex that is adjacent to each unit. And if the enemy enters that hex, you get to fire at them. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So for each occupied redoubt, you put one in the map. At the end of the combat phase, when an enemy unit enters it immediately is attacked using the fire zone table, and there's a specific table which will cause some damage there. RP is repulsed, it has to retreat back. It didn't make it in. RP is still repulsed here. I assume it says the same thing. And then one is a step loss. Okay. So, like I said, different scenarios here. Then some optional rules. And we're not going to play with all of these because some of them are really what-ifs. Like Russians are surprised. Charles XII doesn't take a wound. He took it the day before. Assault equipment. The Swedes marched into battle without their assault equipment. There's some markers here that give them an advantage in trying to take redoubts. Hand grenades. We're going to play with this one. Each grenadier unit has a hand grenade, and it can chuck that and gets basically a column shift in combat. Column shift may not be that big a deal. Remember, it's a differential game. It's not like an odds-based game where you're getting a major, 2 to 1 to 3 to 1 is a big shift. Well, +3 to +4 probably isn't, at least comparison-wise. On turns 10 and 11, we're going to have fatigue, where units pay more movement point for entering easy terrain. It's a very hot day. The prisoners, not here in the game. Here it's only supposed to get into the 90s. Prisoners of war. So if your army's been demoralized, you have the right, let's see, I think, yeah, before your units are attacked, to remove them off the board, and then it only costs you half the morale penalty that you would normally take. Now, I'm assuming there's enough units in the game to prevent people from being able to avoid a loss by just not being demoralizable because their entire army surrendered, but that may be a false assumption. Visibility. Starting on the third turn, we roll a die each turn. On a 4 or 5, we have bad visibility. On a 6, we keep whatever the same was before, which might be good. Good visibility is normal. Bad visibility halves movement allowances. Artillery is only allowed to fire 3 hexes. And leaders can only add their leadership rating to units, to the morale rating of units attempting to rally in the same hex, not adjacent hexes. Grape shot and ammunition supply. Grape shot, I believe, gives you a column shift if you choose to use it. Only artillery can use it. And you have limited amounts of grape shot available. The Swedes have very little, but they only have 1 artillery piece. Flank attacks. If you completely surround a unit, with your units or zones of control, if you attack it, you do a flank attack, and that's going to have the defending unit's strength. Infantry is able to form squares. I'm missing the Cav charge. Oh, that's up here. We skipped that. Okay, the Swedish regular Cav and Dragoons are allowed to charge. They start their movement phase outside an enemy's zone of control. They have to run through 2 clear hexes, and then they'll get a little charge marker, and I believe they get a column shift for that. The infantry square. The infantry can choose to form a square during their movement phase. It costs a movement point, and then they're not going to be able to move until they leave square. They can't do it in a zone of control. It's not subject to flank attacks, and Cav have their attack factors halved. So even charging Cav comes out even, but which seems a little weird because it's an era where I think the carousel is still in play, and another factor is bombardment of squares isn't given a modifier, and I think it should be more effective to use artillery against squares. But that's not covered in here. You can dismount Dragoons, and there are markers for that too somewhere in here. Here they are. And then they just become infantry units with the same stats. Why would you want to do that? Well, if you're facing squares, for example. Rapid fire. Everybody's got about 40 rounds of ammunition on them, which means in a long day of fighting, you'd run out of ammo. You're allowed to take a column shift in your favor, right? No, double the combat strength of your infantry units in a combat by declaring that you're basically shooting all your ammo. And you get an ammo depleted marker here. The ammo depleted will be halved in its firepower from then on. And you can't do this on the last few turns of the game when you would really want to, because presumably you've used up most of your ammo already by that point. Cav can retreat before combat. They're attacked just by infantry or artillery. These are all optional rolls, but we're playing with most of them. Cav must not retreat before combat when attacked by artillery that are bombarding them, though. Cav versus routed infantry. The Cav will be doubled in strength. There's some aids. These are one turn only command and control sources. You branch them off your army commander. They can move around and keep units in command for that turn. But there's a 1 in 6 chance when they're formed that they just fail, that somebody shot them or something as they happened. The horse artillery, it's these 2 units. They're treated as Cav for movement, but if they move their full movement allowance on a 5 or a 6 each time they roll, they end up having carriage breakdown and they get no movement allowance from then on. And that is about it. Like I said, you know, there's a fairly small number of rules over sort of the basic Napoleon at Waterloo type system, but it does look like when you start adding morale in, army morale, the command and control, and all this other stuff, you actually have a fair amount going on here that might be more interesting than one would originally maybe think. So I know I've played it at least once, maybe once solo and once with my ex-wife. I don't remember having a strongly positive reaction to it. My general feeling about a game like this is, geez, you know, I mean, it's great that they're actually covering something like Poltava, but can't somebody do it right? You know? At the time this came out, basically so few games were coming. I was aware of so few games that were, you know, kind of detailed from eras outside of the American Civil War and Napoleonic and a couple of other, even Napoleonic was pretty damn sparse. There were really only a couple of key areas that handled kind of detailed battle games. Nowadays, we've covered a lot more ground. I'm still not aware of something that that stands out as a big system game on Poltava. The problem with it is, what would this system be? We're talking halfway between kind of Musket and Pike and 7 Years' War. The closest that I've got to that is from about the same time period, although not the same same area of the country, the famous Victory and Fields of Glory, which were great moments in history's great battles, great leaders series. And that was really kind of a slapshot series, but it at least went into some detail. I know that Legion Games is making something, I think, on Malplaquet. It would be nice to see games from this era starting to get some serious attention with detailed systems to handle them. Unfortunately, the Great Battles, Great Leaders ones, I don't think were terribly historically accurate. I feel like ideas were transplanted from that would have worked better in another era. And, in this case, the Eastern War is significantly different from the war in the Netherlands. So the Great Northern War probably would actually need some significant differences from the linear tactics that were used in Marlborough's battles. And how much room is there to develop a musket and pike for this era and then, modify it enough to handle this kind of situation? I don't know. My hope is someday we see Battles of the Age of Reason has some popularity now. Maybe we'll be reaching back a little bit further here.